Please don't touch me, she begged, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her dirt-stained cheeks. The cowboy standing before her froze, his calloused hand halfway to her wounded shoulder, his steel-gray eyes searching her terrified face in the flickering firelight. "I'll only protect you always," he said quietly, his voice rough as desert wind. "But someone's coming, and if you can't ride, we're both dead by morning." The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, growing closer through the canyon walls. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the rhythm. 3 riders, just like before. Just like the night everything changed. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. How had it come to this? How had Clara Whitmore, once a respected teacher from Boston, ended up bleeding and broken in a stranger's cabin, begging a man not to touch her while killers closed in on their hideout? The answer lay in a deception that began 3 weeks ago with a letter that promised hope but delivered only horror, a letter that spoke of marriage and new beginnings but concealed the darkest of intentions, a letter that brought her west to a man who wasn't the gentle widower he claimed to be, but something far more dangerous. Now she crouched in this remote cabin, her wedding dress torn and bloodied, facing a cowboy whose reputation was as dark as his past. Jake Morrison. They whispered his name in saloons from here to Colorado. Some said he was a killer. Others claimed he was the only man who could outgun the devils that roamed these territories. But as his eyes met hers in the amber glow of the fire, Clara saw something that made her heart skip despite her terror. Behind the hardened exterior, behind the scars that mapped his face like a violent history, she glimpsed something unexpected. Kindness. The hoofbeats were getting closer now, accompanied by voices that made Clara's blood run cold. They'd found her again. After 3 days of running, hiding, praying that the nightmare would end, her past had caught up with her in this godforsaken corner of Wyoming territory. "Ma'am," Jake said softly, still holding his hand in the air where she could see it, "I know you got reasons to fear a man's touch. But if you want to see another sunrise, you're gonna have to trust me." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its mournful cry mixing with the approaching sounds of pursuit. Clara looked into Jake's weathered face and realized she was about to make the most important decision of her life. The choice that would save or damn Clara Whitmore had begun 23 days earlier, in the suffocating heat of a Boston boarding house where desperation wore a lady's dress. "Miss Whitmore, your rent is 3 weeks overdue." Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the sweltering afternoon like a blade through silk. "I'm afraid I'll need payment by tomorrow or you'll need to find other accommodations." Clara stared at the eviction notice in her trembling hands, the words blurring through unshed tears. Her teaching position had been eliminated when the school board decided that a woman of her circumstances was no longer suitable for molding young minds. Her circumstances being that her father, the respected Professor Whitmore, had died leaving nothing but debts and scandal. The mail-order bride advertisement had appeared like divine intervention, tucked between notices for patent medicines and land sales in the weekly newspaper. "Gentle widower seeks educated wife for companionship and managing of household. Wyoming territory. Transportation provided. Write to W. Dalton, Pine Ridge." The letter that came in response had been everything Clara hoped for: kind, respectful, promising a simple life of mutual respect and shared responsibilities. William Dalton wrote of his small ranch, his need for an educated woman to help with correspondence, and his desire for quiet companionship after the loss of his beloved first wife. What the letter hadn't mentioned was that William Dalton was dead and had been for over a year. Clara discovered this when she stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Pine Ridge, her few belongings clutched in her aching hands, only to be greeted by 3 men whose eyes held nothing resembling kindness. The man who claimed to be her intended husband bore no resemblance to the photograph she'd been sent. This William Dalton was cruel-faced and cold, with hands that moved too quickly and words that carried threats instead of promises. "You'll do nicely," he had said, circling her like a wolf evaluating prey. Pretty enough and desperate enough not to ask too many questions. The truth came out in horrifying pieces over the following days. There was no ranch, only a ramshackle cabin where women disappeared and were never seen again. There was no gentle widower, only a man who collected desperate women through false advertisements and sold them to the highest bidder. And there was no escape because Pine Ridge was 300 miles from anywhere, surrounded by wilderness that could kill the unprepared faster than any bullet. Clara had endured 4 days of hell before she found her chance. When Dalton and his men rode out to collect another bride from the neighboring town, she'd grabbed what supplies she could carry and run into the vast Wyoming wilderness with nothing but hope and determination driving her forward. She'd been running for 3 days when exhaustion and a twisted ankle had forced her to take shelter in what appeared to be an abandoned line cabin. That's where Jake Morrison had found her, bleeding and delirious from fever, muttering warnings about men who collected women like some men collected livestock. He could have ignored her, left her to whatever fate awaited. Instead, he'd brought her to his cabin, tended her wounds, and listened to her story with a face carved from stone and eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. But when she'd finished talking, when the full horror of her situation lay bare between them, Jake Morrison had done something that surprised them both. He'd offered to help. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" Clara had whispered. His answer had been simple, delivered in that rough voice that seemed to carry the weight of old sorrows. Because sometimes a man's got to choose what side of hell he wants to stand on. Now, as the sound of approaching riders grew louder in the mountain air, Clara realized that Jake Morrison's choice was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible. The sound of Jake's boots on the cabin floor was the only thing keeping Clara anchored to sanity as panic threatened to consume her completely. He moved with the fluid efficiency of a man accustomed to danger, checking his weapons, extinguishing the lanterns, securing the cabin's defenses with movements so practiced they seemed almost ritual. But it was the careful way he avoided looking at her, the deliberate space he maintained between them, that told Clara he understood the depth of her trauma better than most. "How many?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant sound of hoofbeats. "3, maybe 4, Jake replied, peering through a gap in the shuttered window. "Same as you said would come." His gray eyes found hers in the dim moonlight filtering through the cabin. "You sure it's them?" Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She would recognize that particular rhythm anywhere. Dalton always rode in the center, with his 2 accomplices flanking him, like wolves hunting in formation. It was the same pattern that had haunted her nightmares since her escape. "Listen to me carefully," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "There's a root cellar beneath that floorboard by the stove. If things go badly, you get down there and you stay hidden until sunrise, no matter what you hear up here. Understood?" "What about you?" Something flickered across his weathered features, an expression too complex to read in the shifting shadows. "I've been dancing with devils longer than you've been breathing, ma'am. This ain't my first time at this particular party." The hoofbeats were closer now, close enough that Clara could distinguish individual horses, close enough to hear voices calling her name in sing-song taunts that made her skin crawl. "Clara, sweet little Clara, we know you're out here somewhere." Dalton's voice carried across the night air like poisoned honey. "Come on out, darling. We're not angry about your little adventure. We understand a spirited filly needs to stretch her legs sometimes." Jake's jaw tightened, and Clara saw his hand drift instinctively toward the Colt 45 strapped to his thigh. The gesture was so natural, so unconscious, that she realized this man had spent years living on the knife's edge between life and death. "Who are you really?" she found herself asking. "The people in town, they whisper about Jake Morrison like he's some kind of legend." For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of old ghosts and older regrets. "I was a lawman once, marshal of a little town down in Colorado territory. Had a wife, a baby on the way, thought I was building something that mattered." His voice grew distant, hollow. "Then one day I came home and found them both dead, killed by the very men I'd been too honorable to shoot when I had the chance." Clara felt her heart clench at the raw pain in his voice. "I'm sorry. After that, I learned there's 2 kinds of justice in this world. The kind that comes from judges and juries and the kind that comes from a fast draw and a steady aim. I've been dealing in the second kind ever since. The voices outside grew louder, more insistent. They were close enough now that Clara could make out individual words, each one a promise of horrors to come. 3 years I've been tracking men like your Mr. Dalton, Jake continued, checking the loads in his rifle with practiced efficiency. Men who prey on the desperate and the innocent. Some might call it revenge. I call it cleanup. Clara understood then why fate had led her to this cabin, to this man who carried justice in his holster and vengeance in his heart. She also understood why he maintained that careful distance between them, why he wouldn't touch her even to tend her wounds. Jake Morrison was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything. He was trying to protect them both from the dangerous intimacy that could grow between two broken souls seeking shelter in each other's pain. But as Dalton's laughter echoed through the mountain air like the sound of approaching damnation, Clara realized that some forms of protection required a different kind of courage entirely. What happened next would forever change Clara's understanding of the fine line between salvation and damnation. Jake positioned himself at the main window, rifle ready, while Clara crouched near the root cellar entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the gaps in the shutters, she could see torches moving in the darkness. 3 distinct points of light weaving between the pine trees that surrounded the cabin. "Jake Morrison," Dalton's voice boomed across the clearing. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got our property with you." "Property?" Jake's voice was deadly quiet as he called back. "That what you call a human being?" Dalton's laughter was like breaking glass. "That little filly signing a contract, Morrison, legal and binding. She owes us compensation for the trouble she's caused." Clara watched Jake's knuckles whiten around his rifle stock. In the pale moonlight, she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his breathing had gone shallow and controlled. This was a man balancing on the razor's edge of violence. "The only thing she owes," Jake replied, "is a prayer of thanks that she got away from you animals while she still could." "Now that's not very neighborly," came a second voice, rougher with a cruel edge that made Clara's skin crawl. She recognized it as belonging to Dalton's primary enforcer, a man called Briggs, who collected debts with brass knuckles and broken bones. "Maybe we should come in there and discuss this like civilized folks. Maybe you should consider that this is private property," Jake countered, "and I don't take kindly to uninvited guests." The torches stopped moving. In the sudden silence, Clara could hear her own breathing, unnaturally loud in the confined space of the cabin. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a lonely sound that seemed to emphasize their isolation. "You know what I think, Morrison?" Dalton's voice had taken on a different quality now. Calculating. Predatory. "I think you've gotten attached to our little runaway. I think maybe you're thinking with something other than that famous gun of yours." Jake didn't respond, but Clara saw the way his shoulders tensed. She realized with growing dread that Dalton was probing for weaknesses, looking for emotional leverage that could be exploited. "Tell you what," Dalton continued, his tone now sickeningly reasonable. "You send the girl out and we'll be on our way. No harm to you, no trouble for anyone. She's not your concern, Morrison. Don't make her your problem." "Already is my problem," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to the men outside. That's when Clara understood. Jake Morrison wasn't just protecting her out of some abstract sense of justice or masculine honor. Somewhere in the past few days, as he tended her wounds and listened to her story, something had shifted. The careful distance he maintained wasn't just about respecting her trauma. It was about protecting his own heart from forming attachments that could get them both killed. "Last chance, Morrison," Briggs shouted. "Send her out or we come in shooting." Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. Rising from her crouch by the root cellar, she moved to Jake's at the window. He turned, startled, his gray eyes wide with something approaching alarm. "What are you doing?" "I'm done running," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'm done letting other people fight my battles for me." Before Jake could stop her, Clara raised her voice to carry across the clearing. "I'm here, Dalton, and I'm not your property. I never was." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Then came the sound of hammers being pulled back on rifles, and Clara knew that the talking was over. The first shot shattered the night silence like thunder, splintering wood just inches from Clara's head. Jake's arms swept around her waist, pulling her down below the window line as bullets began to pepper the cabin walls with deadly precision. His touch was gentle but urgent, and for the first time since her ordeal began, Clara didn't flinch from a man's hands. "Stay low," he growled, positioning himself to return fire. "And for God's sake, don't give them a target." The attack was coordinated and ruthless. Dalton's men had clearly done this before, one keeping the cabin's defenders pinned down with steady rifle fire while the others moved to flanking positions. Through the chaos of splintering wood and breaking glass, Clara could hear boots on the cabin's roof. "They're trying to burn us out," Jake said grimly, noting the orange glow beginning to flicker at the edges of the shuttered windows. "Fire's always been a coward's weapon." Clara smelled smoke and felt panic rise in her throat like bile. "What do we do?" Instead of answering immediately, Jake did something unexpected. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather journal, pressing it into Clara's hands. "If I don't make it through this," he said quietly, "you take this to Marshal Hendricks in Cheyenne. Everything you need to know about Dalton's operation is in there. Locations, names, how many women they've taken. Promise me." Clara stared at the journal, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "You've been hunting them. This wasn't coincidence, you finding me." "I've been tracking Dalton for 8 months," Jake admitted, reloading his rifle with steady hands despite the bullets flying overhead. "You're the first one who got away, the first one who could testify to what they're doing." The smoke was getting thicker now, seeping through gaps in the walls. Soon they would have to choose between burning alive and facing Dalton's guns in the open. "There's another way out," Jake said, nodding toward the back wall of the cabin. "Root cellar connects to an old mining tunnel that comes out about 100 yards downhill. I can hold them here while you—" "No." Clara's voice was firm, surprising them both. "We go together or we don't go at all." Jake's gray eyes searched her face in the flickering firelight. "Ma'am, I appreciate the sentiment, but—" "My name is Clara," she interrupted, "and I meant what I said about being done with running. Besides," she added with a shaky smile, "someone needs to watch your back while you watch mine." Before Jake could argue, a new sound cut through the chaos, the heavy thud of boots on the cabin's front porch. Dalton and his men were moving in for the final assault. "All right then, Clara," Jake said, and she heard something new in his voice. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You know how to handle a gun?" "My father taught me to shoot rabbits back in Massachusetts," she admitted, "though I suspect men are considerably less cooperative than rabbits." Despite everything, Jake almost smiled. The principle's the same. Just aim for center mass and squeeze. Don't pull. He handed her his backup revolver, a smaller Colt that felt surprisingly natural in her grip. The weight of it was both terrifying and empowering. "When I give the signal," Jake continued, "we make for that tunnel. I'll cover our retreat, you just focus on getting to safety." Clara nodded, then surprised herself by reaching out to touch his arm. He went very still under her fingers, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise perhaps, and something deeper. "Jake," she said quietly, "thank you for everything." For a moment, the sounds of battle seemed to fade. In the space between heartbeats, Clara saw past the hardened gunfighter to the man beneath, the one who had loved and lost, who carried justice like a burden and wore loneliness like armor. Then the front door exploded inward, and hell came calling with guns blazing. The cabin erupted into chaos as Dalton's men poured through the shattered doorway like wolves scenting blood. Jake's rifle spoke first, a booming crack that sent the lead attacker spinning backward into the night. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, spreading out to avoid presenting clustered targets. "Now!" Jake shouted, grabbing Clara's hand and pulling her toward the back of the cabin. The root cellar entrance was a narrow trapdoor concealed beneath a worn rug. Jake yanked it open, revealing a ladder that disappeared into impenetrable darkness. The tunnel beyond smelled of earth and old timber, but it represented their only hope of escape. "Ladies first," Jake said, though his attention never left the advancing men. Clara swung her legs over the opening, then paused. Something in Jake's voice, in the way he held his rifle, told her he was planning something heroic and stupid. "Don't you dare," she said fiercely. Don't you dare try to hold them off alone while I escape. We do this together, remember? Clara. Together, she repeated, and there was steel in her voice that surprised them both. Jake looked at her for one long moment, then nodded. Together it is. They descended into the tunnel side by side, Jake pulling the trapdoor closed above them, just as boots thundered overhead. The darkness was complete, absolute, broken only by the faint rectangle of light filtering through gaps in the floor above. The tunnel was older than the cabin, carved from living rock and shored up with timber that groaned ominously as they moved through it. Clara kept one hand on the rough stone wall and the other firmly gripped around Jake's coat sleeve, using his presence as an anchor against the suffocating darkness. Behind them, they could hear shouts of frustration as Dalton's men searched the burning cabin. It wouldn't take them long to find the tunnel entrance. Keep moving, Jake whispered. This connects to an old silver mine about 200 yards out. If we can reach the main shaft, we can... His words were cut off by the sound of the trapdoor being yanked open behind them. Torchlight flooded the tunnel, casting their shadows long and desperate against the tunnel walls. Found them! Briggs's voice echoed off the stone. They're in the old mining works. Jake cursed under his breath and increased their pace. The tunnel ahead curved sharply to the left, following the natural contours of the rock. Clara's ankle, still tender from her original injury, began to throb with each step, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. Boots on stone, the flicker of torches, voices calling out coordinates and directions. Dalton's men knew these mountains, Clara realized with growing dread. They had planned for this contingency. There, Jake pointed ahead to where the tunnel opened into a larger space. The main shaft, if we can reach the surface entrance. A gunshot boomed behind them, the bullet ricocheting off the tunnel walls with a sound like angry hornets. Clara ducked instinctively, and Jake pushed her ahead of him, using his body as a shield. They stumbled into the main mining chamber, a vast hollow carved from the mountain's heart, with wooden platforms and rusted equipment scattered throughout. High above, Clara could see a square of star-filled sky where the original miners had sunk their shaft. But between them and freedom stood a ladder that stretched up into darkness, its rungs slick with decades of moisture and neglect. Can you climb? Jake asked urgently. Clara looked up at the dizzying ascent and felt her stomach drop. But behind them, the sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and she could smell smoke from the burning cabin drifting down through the shaft. I can do whatever I have to do, she said, and meant it. Jake went first, testing each rung before committing his weight. Clara followed, her dress catching on splinters and rough edges, her injured ankle screaming protest with every step upward. Halfway up, she heard voices echoing from the tunnel below. Dalton had found their escape route. Move faster, Jake urged from above, but Clara was already climbing as fast as she dared. That's when she heard the most terrifying sound of all. Dalton's laughter floating up from the depths like a promise of doom. The ladder rungs were slick with Mountain Dew and 40 years of neglect, each one a potential death trap that could send Clara plummeting into the darkness below. Her hands were raw and bleeding from gripping the rough wood, and her injured ankles sent shoots of fire up her leg with every step. But the sounds of pursuit from below drove her upward with desperate determination. Jake climbed above her, testing each rung before she put her weight on it, occasionally reaching down to steady her when her grip faltered. His presence above her was both reassuring and terrifying. If he fell, they would both plummet to their deaths in the abandoned shaft. Almost there, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the echo of shouts from below. Clara risked a glance upward and saw the blessed square of starlit sky growing larger. Freedom was perhaps 20 feet above them, but it might as well have been 20 miles. Her strength was fading fast, and she could feel her grip beginning to weaken. That's when the first shot rang out from below. The bullet spanged off the ladder just inches from Clara's head, sending splinters of wood raining down into her hair. She bit back a scream and forced herself to climb faster, knowing that Dalton's men were now close enough to make accurate shots in the confined space of the shaft. Clara, listen to me, Jake called down softly. When you reach the top, don't wait for me. Run for the tree line and keep going until you reach the main trail. Follow it east toward Cheyenne. It's about 60 miles, but there are way stations where you can get help. I told you, Clara panted. hauling herself up another rung. We do this together or not at all. Another shot boomed below them, this one close enough that Clara felt the wind of the bullet's passage. Dalton's men were climbing now too, following them up the shaft with deadly intent. Jake reached the surface first, hauling himself over the rim of the shaft with fluid grace. Then his hand appeared above her, strong and steady in the starlight. "Give me your hand," he said. For just a moment, Clara hesitated. Since her ordeal began, the touch of any man's hands had filled her with revulsion and terror. But looking up at Jake's weathered face in the moonlight, seeing the patience and understanding in his gray eyes, she realized that something fundamental had changed. She reached up and grasped his hand. His grip was firm but gentle as he pulled her up and out of the mining shaft. The night air hit her face like a blessing, clean and cold and free of the suffocating closeness of underground spaces. For a moment, she simply lay on the rocky ground beside the shaft opening, breathing deeply and marveling at her survival. But their respite was brief. Voices echoed from the shaft below, and the flicker of torchlight painted the walls in dancing shadows. Dalton's men were still coming, and they would reach the surface within minutes. "This way," Jake said, helping Clara to her feet. "There's a creek about half a mile north. We can follow it downstream and throw them off our trail." They ran through the pine forest, dodging between trees and leaping over fallen logs in their desperate flight. Clara's ankle throbbed with every step, but fear and adrenaline kept her moving. Behind them, she could hear shouts as Dalton's men reached the surface and spread out to search for their trail. The creek, when they reached it, was little more than a trickle of water running over smooth stones. But it would serve their purpose, masking their footprints and scent from any tracking dogs or Dalton might have brought. They waded downstream in silence, the icy water numbing Clara's feet and soaking through her already tattered dress. The stars overhead provided just enough light to navigate by, but also meant they would be visible to any pursuers who got close enough. "Jake," Clara whispered as they rounded a bend in the creek. "Back in the cabin, you said this wasn't your first time dealing with men like Dalton. How many others have there been?" His face was a mask in the starlight, but she heard something in his voice when he answered. A weariness that went bone deep. "Too many," he said simply, "and not nearly enough." That's when they heard the howl, long and mournful and definitely not made by any wolf. The howl that echoed through the mountain night was a signal, Clara realized with growing dread. Dalton's men communicating their positions as they spread out to surround their prey. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her deeper into the creek bed, where overhanging willows provided some concealment. The water was knee-deep here, flowing over smooth river rocks that threatened to turn their desperate flight into a bone-breaking tumble with every step. "They're using hunting calls," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the babble of running water. "Professional bounty hunters, most likely." Dalton's brought in specialists. Clara felt her heart sink. They were no longer dealing with the crude thugs who had terrorized her in Pine Ridge. These were men who tracked human prey for a living, who knew every trick and hiding place the wilderness could offer. "How many?" she asked. "At least 6, maybe more." Jake's eyes scanned the shadows beyond the creek, reading signs invisible to Clara's untrained gaze. "They've got us bracketed. Men upstream and down, probably others moving to cut off the main trail." Another howl answered the first, this one closer and coming from a different direction. Then a third, completing a triangle of sound that seemed to close around them like a noose. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles south," Jake said, making a decision. "If we can reach it, we might be able to hold them off until daylight." "And then what?" Jake's smile was grim in the moonlight. "Then we pray that Marshal Hendricks got my telegraph message about Dalton's operation." They left the creek reluctantly, knowing that their wet footprints would leave an obvious trail on the rocky ground. But staying in the water would slow them too much, and speed was now their only advantage. The forest seemed alive with menace as they moved through it. Every shadow could hide a gunman. Every rustling branch might signal an approaching enemy. Clara found herself jumping at sounds that turned out to be nothing more than wind or small animals, while Jake moved with the controlled tension of a man who had spent years living on the edge of violence. "Tell me about your wife," Clara whispered as they paused behind a fallen log to catch their breath and listen for sounds of pursuit. Jake went very still. "Why?" Because I need to think about something other than dying tonight, she said honestly. And because I want to understand the man who's risking his life to save mine. For a long moment, Jake didn't respond. Then so quietly she had to strain to hear him over the night sounds of the forest, he began to speak. Her name was Sarah. She was a school teacher, like you. Had the prettiest laugh you ever heard, and she could make biscuits that would make a grown man weep with joy. His voice grew distant, remembering. We were married 2 years, had a little girl on the way. I was building us a house with my own hands, planning to add rooms as our family grew. What happened? The Kershaw gang rode into town while I was out serving a warrant 2 counties over. They robbed the bank, shot up the saloon, and when Sarah tried to get the school children to safety, he stopped, unable to continue. Clara reached out instinctively, her hand covering his. This time there was no hesitation, no fear, only the need to comfort a wounded soul. After the funeral, I tracked the Kershaws for 3 years, Jake continued, his voice hollow. Killed them all, one by one. Thought it would bring me peace, but all it brought was emptiness. So I kept tracking, kept hunting the kind of men who prey on the innocent. Figured maybe if I couldn't save Sarah, I could save someone else. And that's what I am to you? Clara asked quietly, a chance at redemption. Jake turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. At first maybe, he admitted, but not anymore. Before Clara could ask what he meant, a new sound reached them through the forest night, the soft whinny of horses moving through the trees. They'd found them. The horses were coming from 3 directions at once, closing in with the methodical precision of experienced manhunters. Jake pressed Clara down behind the fallen log, his hand gentle but insistent on her shoulder. In the filtered moonlight, she could see him calculating angles and distances, his mind working through tactical possibilities, with the cold efficiency of a man who had survived too many desperate situations. Listen carefully, he whispered, his lips almost touching her ear. When I give the signal, you run straight south through those aspens. Don't stop, don't look back, no matter what you hear behind you. The trapper's cabin is built into a rock outcropping. You'll know it when you see it. What about you? I'm going to buy you some time. Clara gripped his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. Jake Morrison, you promised me we'd do this together. Don't you dare break that promise now. Something flickered in his gray eyes, surprise perhaps, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken despite their desperate circumstances. Ma'am, Clara, what I said back there about Sarah, about why I've been hunting men like Dalton. He paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to a man accustomed to speaking with actions rather than sentiments. What I'm trying to say is, somewhere along the way, this stopped being about redemption. Then what is it about? The sound of approaching riders was getting closer, accompanied by the low voices of men coordinating their attack. In the distance, Clara could hear Dalton himself calling out taunts and threats, his voice carrying an edge of frustrated fury. It's about you, Jake said simply, about the way you looked when you told them you weren't their property, about how you climbed that ladder with a twisted ankle and bullets flying around your head, about how you reached for my hand at the mine shaft, even though I could see what it cost you to trust any man's touch. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with their desperate flight or the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Jake, I love you, Clara Whitmore, he said quietly, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. Don't know when it happened, don't know how, but there it is. And that's why you're going to run when I tell you to, because I'll be damned if I'll let anything happen to the best thing that's walked into my life since Sarah died. Before Clara could respond, gunfire erupted around them. Muzzle flashes lit up the forest like deadly fireflies as Dalton's men opened fire from multiple positions. Bullets whined through the air overhead, splintering bark and sending showers of pine needles down on their hiding place. Jake returned fire with methodical precision, his rifle speaking in measured intervals as he picked his targets. But Clara could see they were hopelessly outnumbered. For every shot Jake fired, 3 or 4 came back in response. Now, Jake shouted, rising to lay down covering fire. Run! But instead of running, Clara did something that surprised them both. She raised the revolver Jake had given her and added her own fire to his, sending bullets toward the muzzle flashes, winking in the darkness. "I said run!" "And I said together," Clara shouted back, squeezing off another shot at a shadow moving through the trees. "I meant it then, and I mean it now." For just a moment, despite the bullets flying around them and the desperate nature of their situation, Jake Morrison smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered features and made him look years younger. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," he called out as he reloaded, "or the most stubborn." "Both," Clara replied, surprising herself with her own fierce grin. That's when Dalton's voice rang out across the battlefield, closer than before and filled with cold promise. "Enough games, Morrison. Time to end this." Dalton stepped into the moonlit clearing like a figure from Clara's worst nightmares, his face a mask of controlled fury in the silvery light. He wasn't alone. 3 men flanked him, their rifles trained on the fallen log where Clara and Jake had taken shelter. Behind them, Clara could see more shadows moving in the tree line, cutting off any hope of escape. "William Dalton," Jake said, rising slowly with his hands visible but ready. "Been looking for you for quite some time." "Have you now?" Dalton's voice carried the cultured accent of an educated man, which somehow made his presence more disturbing than if he'd been a crude frontier criminal. "And I've been hearing stories about the famous Jake Morrison. They say you're fast with that gun, but are you fast enough to save your little lady friend here?" Clara stood beside Jake, her own weapon steady despite the tremor in her hands. The weight of the revolver was both comforting and terrifying. She knew she was prepared to use it, but also knew that her limited shooting experience was no match for professional killers. "Let her go, Dalton," Jake said quietly. "Your quarrel's with me now." Dalton laughed, the sound like breaking glass in the mountain air. "Oh, I don't think so, Marshal Morrison. You see, Miss Whitmore here has caused me considerable expense and inconvenience. She's also seen too much of my operation to simply walk away. No, I'm afraid both of you have become rather permanent problems that require permanent solutions. The authorities know about your mail-order bride scheme," Clara said, finding her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Marshal Hendricks in Cheyenne has all the evidence he needs." "Marshal Hendricks," Dalton mused, "is unfortunately going to suffer a tragic accident on his way back from Denver next week. Terrible thing, mountain roads. So many ways for a man to simply disappear." Clara felt Jake tense beside her, and she realized that Dalton's network of corruption ran deeper than they'd imagined. This wasn't just a local problem. It was an organized criminal operation with tentacles reaching into law enforcement itself. "You're finished, Dalton," Jake said with quiet certainty. "Maybe not today, maybe not by me, but men like you always are. Someone faster, someone smarter, someone with more to lose. They always come along eventually." "Perhaps," Dalton conceded with mock graciousness, "but you won't be around to see it." The silence that followed was pregnant with violence. Clara could feel the tension building like the pressure before a thunderstorm, that moment when the air itself seems to hold its breath before chaos erupts. "I want you to know something," Jake said, his voice carrying across the clearing with crystalline clarity. "Before this ends, I want you to know that you failed. She got away from you, Dalton. This one got away, and she's going to make sure the world knows what you really are." Dalton's cultured mask slipped for just an instant, revealing the savage underneath. "She's not going anywhere, Morrison. Neither of you are." That's when Clara did something that would be talked about in frontier saloons for years to come. Instead of waiting for Jake to make his play, instead of hiding behind the fallen log like a helpless victim, she stepped forward into the moonlight where everyone could see her. "My name is Clara Elizabeth Whitmore," she called out in a voice that carried to every corner of the clearing. "I am a teacher from Boston, Massachusetts, and I am not now, nor have I ever been any man's property. I came west seeking a new life, and instead I found something more precious than I ever imagined." She turned to look at Jake, her eyes finding his in the uncertain light. "I found love," she said simply. "Real love, with a man worthy of it. And that's something you can never take away, no matter what happens here tonight." Jake's expression in that moment was something to behold. Wonder and pride and fierce protective love all mixed together on his weathered features. "Clara, I love you too, Jake Morrison," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "Whatever comes next, I want you to know that." Dalton raised his rifle with deliberate slowness, his finger tightening on the trigger. "How touching," he sneered. "Romeo and Juliet in the wilderness. Let's see if your love story has a happier ending than theirs." What happened in the next 10 seconds would become the stuff of legend in the saloons and frontier towns from Colorado to Montana. Jake's hand moved to his Colt with a speed that seemed to bend the very laws of physics. The gun appeared in his grip as if by magic, muzzle flame blooming like a deadly flower in the moonlight. His first shot took Dalton in the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocky ground. But Dalton's men were professionals, and they reacted with the coordinated precision of experienced killers. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, turning the peaceful mountain clearing into a battlefield painted in fire and shadow. Clara dove behind a boulder as bullets whined through the air where she'd been standing. She could see Jake moving with lethal grace, rolling behind cover and returning fire with methodical accuracy. Each shot from his gun seemed to find its mark, but there were too many enemies and too little cover. "Behind you!" Clara screamed as she saw a gunman emerging from the tree line to Jake's left. Jake spun and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet taking the man's center mass and dropping him where he stood. But the movement exposed him to fire from another angle, and Clara watched in horror as Jake stumbled, clutching his side where a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. "Jake!" She was moving before conscious thought could stop her, running across the open ground toward his position despite the bullets cutting the air around her. Her own gun barked twice as she fired at muzzle flashes in the darkness, not caring about aim or accuracy, only about reaching the man she loved. Jake was behind a fallen tree, blood seeping through his fingers as he tried to maintain pressure on his wound. His face was pale in the moonlight, but his eyes were still alert, still dangerous. "Told you to run," he said with a weak smile. "And I told you I don't take orders," Clara replied, tearing strips from her already tattered dress to make bandages. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Jake admitted, then raised his head as the gunfire around them suddenly ceased. "But that's the least of our problems right now." Dalton's voice rang out across the clearing, strained with pain but still carrying that cultured menace that made Clara's skin crawl. "Enough!" he shouted. "This ends now, one way or another. Morrison, you and your lady step out into the open or I start executing the hostages." "What hostages?" Clara whispered. But even as she spoke, she heard sounds that made her blood run cold. The frightened whimpers of women, the rattle of chains, the cruel laughter of men enjoying their power over the helpless. "That's right," Dalton called out, reading their horror even in the darkness. "Did you think you were the only one, Miss Whitmore? I've got 4 more of your sisters in trade right here. Women who answered advertisements just like you did. Women who trusted in promises of new lives and honest marriages." Clara closed her eyes, feeling sick. While she had been fighting for her freedom, other women had been suffering the fate she had escaped. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, guilt and rage warring in her chest. "Let them go, Dalton," Jake called out, his voice steady despite his injury. "They're not part of this." "Oh, but they are," Dalton replied. "They're my insurance policy. You have 60 seconds to show yourselves, or I start putting bullets in innocent women. Your choice, Morrison." Clara looked at Jake, seeing her own anguish reflected in his gray eyes. They both understood the impossible choice Dalton was offering them: surrender and die, or condemn innocent women to death in their place. "There has to be another way," Clara whispered. Jake was quiet for a moment, his mind working through possibilities with the methodical calculation of a man who had faced impossible odds before and survived. "Maybe there is," he said finally, reaching into his boot and pulling out a small derringer, a gambler's gun designed for close work and desperate situations. "But it's going to require perfect timing and a considerable amount of luck." "What do you need me to do?" Jake looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with dread. "I need you to trust me one more time," he said quietly, "and I need you to be ready to run when I give the signal." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Jake was kissing her, soft and desperate, and full of all the things they might never have the chance to say to each other. When he pulled away, his eyes held a finality that terrified her. "Remember what I told you about love, Clara Whitmore," he whispered. "Hold on to that, no matter what happens next." The plan Jake Morrison set in motion in those final moments was as desperate as it was brilliant, requiring split-second timing and the kind of calculated risk that separated legends from corpses. "30 seconds, Morrison," Dalton called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like a death sentence. "Time's running out for these ladies." Jake pressed the derringer into Clara's hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. "When I stand up, you count to 5. Then you put a bullet in that lantern hanging from the tree branch behind Dalton. Can you do that?" Clara looked at the target, a coal oil lantern that provided most of the light illuminating the clearing. It was perhaps 30 yards away, a difficult shot even for an experienced marksman. For a woman whose shooting experience consisted of hunting rabbits with her father, it was nearly impossible. "I can do it," she said simply, because failure wasn't an option. Jake smiled, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. "I believe you can." Then he was moving, rising from behind their shelter, with his hands apparently empty, calling out to Dalton, "All right, you win. I'm coming out." Clara began her count. 1, 2. Jake walked slowly into the moonlight, every step calculated to draw attention away from her position. 3, 4. She could see Dalton's men emerging from the tree line, their weapons trained on Jake's approaching figure. 5. Clara's shot was perfect. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil, plunging the clearing into chaos and darkness. In that instant of confusion, Jake's hidden Colt appeared in his hand like deadly magic, and the night erupted in gunfire once more. But this time the advantage belonged to Jake Morrison. He'd spent years perfecting the art of violence in darkness, while Dalton's men found themselves blind and disoriented. Clara heard the sharp crack of Jake's pistol, followed by cries of pain and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the ground. The battle lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the echoes finally faded, only 2 men remained standing in the clearing, Jake Morrison and William Dalton. Dalton stood swaying in the darkness, clutching a smoking rifle with shaking hands. Even in the dim starlight, Clara could see the dark stains spreading across his shirt, evidence of Jake's marksmanship. "It's over, Dalton," Jake said quietly. "Let the women go." For a moment, it seemed like the nightmare might finally end. Then Dalton's rifle swung toward the cluster of frightened women chained near the tree line, and Clara understood with crystal clarity that the man would rather commit murder than admit defeat. Her second shot of the night was every bit as perfect as her first. Dalton dropped where he stood, his rifle firing harmlessly into the ground. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the sobbing of the rescued women and the distant call of nightbirds in the forest. Clara ran to Jake's side, finding him leaning heavily against a tree, but alive and grimly triumphant. His wound was serious but not fatal, a fact that would become important in the days that followed. The rescue of the 4 captive women led to the discovery of Dalton's entire operation, including account books that detailed the trafficking of dozens of women over the past 3 years. Marshal Hendricks, very much alive despite Dalton's threats, arrived with a federal posse 2 days later to clean up the remnants of the criminal network. Clara testified at the trials that followed, her words helping to convict the surviving members of Dalton's organization. But more importantly, she stood beside Jake Morrison as he recovered from his wounds, tending him with the same fierce determination she'd shown during their desperate flight through the wilderness. 6 months later, in a small church in Cheyenne, Clara Elizabeth Whitmore became Clara Morrison in a ceremony attended by the 4 women whose lives she'd helped save. The bride wore a dress of simple white cotton, purchased with her own money from her new position teaching at the territorial school. The groom wore his best suit and a smile that hadn't dimmed since the morning he had asked her to marry him. Their love story began with deception and violence, was forged in desperate flight and gunfire, and was sealed with trust and courage in the face of impossible odds. It was, in other words, perfectly suited to the wild territory they now called home. Jake never returned to his life as a solitary gunfighter. Instead, he became the sheriff of a growing frontier town, enforcing the law with the same methodical competence he'd once applied to hunting criminals. Clara taught school during the week and helped Jake with his paperwork in the evenings, her Eastern education proving invaluable in bringing civilization to the wilderness. They built a house together, not the grand mansion Clara might have known in Boston, but a solid home of pine logs and careful craftsmanship, with room for the family they both hoped would come. And when their first child was born, a daughter with Clara's dark hair and Jake's steady gray eyes, they named her Sarah, in honor of the woman whose tragedy had set Jake on the path that led him to salvation. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still full of men like Dalton who preyed on the innocent and desperate. But it was also full of people like Jake and Clara Morrison, who had learned that love was worth fighting for, that justice sometimes came from the barrel of a gun, and that two broken souls could heal each other if they had courage enough to trust. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and their daughter slept peacefully in her cradle, Clara would sometimes catch Jake looking at her with wonder in his eyes, as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. At those moments, she would remember that terrifying night in the mountains when she told him she loved him, not knowing if they would live to see another sunrise. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, giving up the wandering life for domestic tranquility. Jake's answer was characteristically simple and absolutely perfect. "Clara Morrison," he said, reaching over to take her hand in his, "the only thing I regret is all the years I spent not knowing you existed." And in the growing darkness of the Wyoming evening, with the sound of their baby's contented breathing drifting from the house behind them, Clara Morrison smiled and held tightly to the hand of the man who had taught her that sometimes when you least expect it, love arrives like salvation in the form of a rough-edged cowboy with gentle hands and a protective heart. Their story would become part of frontier legend, the tale of the Boston schoolteacher and the lonely gunfighter who found each other in the darkness and chose love over fear, justice over revenge, and hope over despair. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth believing in. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the untamed West. If Clara and Jake's story touched your heart, please consider subscribing for more tales of love, courage, and redemption on the frontier. Leave a comment below, sharing your favorite moment from their adventure. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love to transform even the darkest of circumstances into something beautiful.